In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O God, our Heavenly Father, thank you for the many blessings and gifts you've given us this day and every day. We ask for your forgiveness for all the ways that we have fallen short to give you glory in all that we do. We ask for your forgiveness for all the ways that we have failed to be your face to the world. We ask for prayers for all the intentions on the hearts of all those here. We ask for an increase in your grace to illuminate us, enlighten us, and help us to grow in our love for you. Help us tonight as we learn more about your moral teachings and the church and the different values and blessings you've given us in this life. And we pray together, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. And the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right. So today's going to be a little bit of a continuation from last time. If you weren't here last time and you have some questions, definitely ask them at the end. Hopefully there might be some note cards around. If you have questions you just don't want to ask in person, write those down, or I'll stick around afterwards for questions. And then this week is going to be the second part of our moral teachings, specifically looking at some life issues. And then next week will be the social doctrines of the church, which relate. Last week was just overall brief kind of morality review, and today's issues and next week's will all be very much connected. So any questions that you have, I can definitely try to address next week as well. So put those on your cards. All right, so a brief review from last week, just thinking about morality. If you remember last time, we talked about moral and immoral things, and we talked about how things that are moral are ordered to reason. So they're reasonable, ordered to our reason. They're ordered to goodness, to truth. They're ordered to the reality of who we are. So I just put order to reality of who we are as human beings, of who we are as creatures created by a loving God. And then things that are immoral would be opposite to that. So they're disordered. They're not ordered to reason. Now, sometimes whenever people choose to do things that are immoral or that are wrong, they often are seeking a good, but the problem is that it's typically a lesser good. So whenever someone steals for some reason, the person is going to have something they see as being good, something they see as being pleasurable or enjoyable, or like St. Augustine in his Confessions, his friends and him stole a pear from the neighbor's tree. I mean, they stole, and he's like, we just did it because it was wrong and it was fun and we just wanted to do it. But there was still this good. He wasn't intending to do something really evil and horrible. He knew it was wrong, but he thought it'd be something fun to do because it was wrong. So he still has a goodness. It's kind of what we call an apparent goodness, but it is not actually good. So taking something that doesn't belong to you is not good, but you seek it for some type of reason that you convince yourself is a good for yourself. Even consider like serial killers. There's some pleasure they're getting. Now that is not a true good, but it's like this apparent good. And so when we say goodness, it means order to true goodness, things that are truly good for ourselves, truly good for our flourishing, truly good for us to become the person God made us to be. So it's referring to like this true goodness, this true understanding of goodness. And last time we talked a lot about flourishing, our human flourishing. Everything that we do when it comes to following these moral teachings is for our flourishing, is for our perfection, for our holiness, for our sanctification, because God made us to be saints. And so our goal in this life is to become saints, to become the person God made us to be. And that's what these moral teachings are trying to help us to become. And so that's important as we think about these moral things, because sometimes people do hear things the church teaches, and sometimes they're very challenging, and sometimes people have a misunderstanding that these are arbitrary or that these are just legalistic, like the church is just telling us you can't do this because they're trying to be cruel or trying to withhold pleasures or something, like this tyrannical idea, dictatorial idea, but that's not at all the case. Everything the church teaches us are because she knows what we need to do for our flourishing and our perfection. And there's reasons. For everything the church says this is wrong to do, there's reasons. And at the foundation, it's because what she's trying to teach us is something that is truly good for ourselves and for our flourishing. So it's important to keep that in mind, because some of the things we'll talk about tonight, or that I'll hint about tonight, can be challenging, and it's important to understand why the church holds the things that she does. The second thing to remember from last time is that so there's moral and immoral things. And all of the actions that can be either moral or immoral are always freely and deliberately chosen. It can't be something that I accidentally do. I'm freely and deliberately choosing to do X, and then those actions need to be evaluated as to whether that's moral or immoral. So it's freely and deliberately chosen. And then also remembering that we talked about last time, there's different degrees of culpability. Like, how responsible am I for the action, especially when it's immoral. It is still immoral, but there may be different degrees of responsibility I have. And so last time, that's when we talked about how there's the understanding of sin, and then there's the venial and moral sins, which are the different degrees of sin based on the gravity and my knowledge and understanding of what I'm doing, and things like that. So I won't rehash that, but it's important to recognize that there are going to be things that are wrong, and people will have different degrees of sinfulness and of responsibility. And it may be different for each person. I may do action X, someone else may do the same action, but we may have different degrees of culpability because either of our knowledge or our free will to do the things that we're doing. So keep that in mind. Let's see. All right. The final thing I wanted to emphasize too is, let's say, because ignorance can be a factor. If there's something that is wrong and I don't fully realize it's wrong, that does affect my culpability, my responsibility for the action. But even if I do not know that it's wrong, it does not then make it good. It is still a problem. And so it's still a problem in the world. And so it's kind of an example of, let's say that there's a stove with a hot fire, and I don't realize fire is hot. I have no idea it's going to burn my skin. I'm like, ooh, it's going to be fun to stick my hand in that fire. It's not going to hurt me. Well, if I stick my hand in the fire, what's going to happen? It's going to hurt me, even if I don't realize that it will. The same thing happens in a way with immoral actions, is that even if we don't fully understand that it's wrong, it's important for us to try to learn and to understand that it's wrong firstly. But if I do not know at the time and it's wrong and I do it, I may not be as culpable for the sin that I'm committing, but there's still going to be consequences for myself and for others. And so my actions still impact my neighbor and impact my relationship with God, still impact society. So it's still important that these things that are immoral still have consequences, even if I am not necessarily committing a mortal sin because I did not know how grave it was. And so it's really important to recognize that the understanding of these moral teachings is not only just for me as an individual, but also for the flourishing of everyone around me. Because I love my neighbor, God calls us to love our neighbor, and in loving our neighbor, we need to desire what is good for them. And what is good for the other person is for them to flourish and to become saints. And so these moral teachings affect everyone. They're not to be viewed in isolation of just me and my actions and my relationship with God only. It is all of us. And so that brings me back to like C.S. Lewis last week. We talked about the ships and how he talked about when we were trying to navigate our ships, there's external harmony with me and everyone around me, internal harmony within myself. Both of those are involved in my actions, whether I'm doing something moral or immoral. It affects me and others. And then I always have to keep my destination in mind, the fact that I need to become a saint, a desire to be a saint. And then the last point to kind of mention that I talked about last time were the sources of a moral action. And I only got to this a little briefly at the very end, and we're going to get into this a lot more today. So the moral sources, which means kind of when we are looking at a specific individual act, like I'm going to do X, is it moral or immoral? We look at three things: the object, the intention, and the circumstances. And so this is going to be really important today as we look at these. And just as a reminder, the object is kind of what is it that I'm doing? What kind of action is it? The intention, so this is, if you remember, this is the kind of act. You know, what am I doing? The intention is not simply motivation, it's the purpose, it's the goal, the end. So I'll put the end, the purpose. So almost kind of like why. And it does include the motivation, but it's not strictly the motivation. And the circumstances speaks for itself. What are the situations around what it is that I'm doing? And so we're going to, this will come into play more as we look at some of these individual examples. So before I talk about specific life issues the church emphasizes, let me spend a few minutes just using these examples so we can start to see how to go about applying these. And then, as I said, don't forget, I don't want to, when I start to bring up some examples, I'm not trying to make any judgments about the individual. They're fake, fictional examples, but I'm not trying to make a judgment about that person and their sinfulness and how culpable they are. We're just going to look at it kind of broadly with some of these different things. So let's just use kind of a more simple example. Let's say I'm a teenager, I'm walking in a store parking lot with my friends, and there's a shopping cart, and in it there's bread, there's apples, there's milk, and my friends dare me to take it all. Oh, the owner of the cart's not looking, take the food. Take the bread, the apples, the milk. So if they dare me to take it, and I take the apples, the bread, and the milk, then the question is what is the object of the action? What's the object of this that I'm doing? You know, it's taking property of another person without their permission, and it's unreasonable. Why am I doing it? It's unreasonable, and it's taking it without their permission. And so this, in and of itself, is a stealing. So stealing, the object, is not good. So regardless of whatever motivation I may have, that action is not good. All three must be good for the action to be moral. So if I'm stealing, then it doesn't really matter why I'm stealing, because I'm taking the property of another without their permission against their reasonable will. That's how the church would say it. And so the purpose is maybe it's to possess food. Maybe I do want to eat it. And so I'm motivated, or maybe I'm motivated by the desire of hunger. Maybe I'm motivated by the desire to just be popular with my friends because they asked me to do it. They dared me to do it. But that doesn't matter. That motivation doesn't really matter. The object is wrong. The kind of act that it is stealing. And so no matter what the other two situations are, it's immoral. Now, what if we had the same scenario? Me and my friends are homeless and we're hungry. So even if I'm homeless and I'm hungry and I'm starving, my intention is to eat food because I'm starving. The church would say that our ends do not justify the means. So our ends, like our goal, the purpose, do not justify the means, and the means are kind of the object at what I'm doing. Okay, so this is an important thing to keep in mind. St. Paul actually teaches this in Romans, but the ends do not justify the means. So even though I have a good reason, I'm starving, I'm homeless, I'm hungry, I'm still stealing. I'm still taking something that belongs to someone else without their permission. So, it does, the circumstances are such that you can start to begin to understand why I'm in this predicament, but it's still wrong. What should I do in that situation? I should ask the owner. I'm starving, I'm homeless, I'm hungry, and the owner may be willing to give me the food for free. Maybe the owner doesn't need it. But maybe the owner is starving himself. Maybe he has a family of 4 to feed and that's all they're going to have for a few days. So we have to be careful. We just don't know people's situations. But if the owner has a reasonable need for that food as well, we need to be careful even if I'm homeless and have a good motivation. And let's say me and my friends, we're not homeless. We're just average middle class teenagers. And let's say now it's that first scenario, I'm stealing from this person's shopping cart. I'm middle class, I'm not a homeless person. I have plenty of money and plenty of food, but I just want to do it to be popular with my friends. And let's take the circumstances of this person I'm stealing the food from is actually a homeless man. And this was the only food he had for a few days, and I stole it from his cart. The circumstances can actually make my immoral action even worse. So the circumstances can make something can increase the malice of an action. So the circumstances cannot change something bad to become something good, but it can make something that is already bad become worse and have an increase in malice because of the circumstances. So if I'm stealing from a homeless man and now he's going to starve potentially, it does make what I'm doing worse. So the circumstances are important. The other two are typically going to more often than not dictate what's moral or immoral in general, but the circumstances can make the goodness of something even better, or it can make the malice worse, and so that's important to keep in mind. All right, let's take another example. Let's say that we have a person is sleeping. We see him sitting in a chair and they're sleeping. So what's the object? What kind of act is it? It's sleeping. It's a natural bodily action. In and of itself, it's kind of a neutral thing. We're just sleeping. It's a neutral action. And the intention is because I'm really tired. I've been up for 24 hours and I just need to rest. I need to rejuvenate. And my goal is to rejuvenate and renew. So those are okay. But now the circumstances are such that I'm actually a nighttime security guard and I'm on duty. So now it becomes an immoral thing. It becomes wrong what I'm doing. So the object and the intention typically help us to know what's moral or immoral, but sometimes the circumstances can be important, is the caveat there. All right, so let's look at some of the life issues specifically that the church has. I'm going to just talk about some of these broadly. Before we kind of assess specific actions, it's important. I put a lot of quotes on your handouts, and there's way more than I could put there when it comes to what the church teaches about human life and human dignity and the sacredness of life. I did put the names of several church documents that are really important to read. Church documents are absolutely beautiful. The catechism is beautiful on this. So I do encourage you over time to read what the church teaches with these moral issues and moral teachings. But the church does teach that every single human life is sacred. Every person has inviolable dignity. Every person has a fundamental right to life. And the human being, the church says, is to be respected as a person from the moment of conception until the moment of natural death. So from the very moment of conception, we must respect that human being as a person, which means that they do have a right to life, they have a right to respect and to be protected, and then to protect that life, that innocent life until natural death. And the church emphasizes that this value of a person's life, their dignity, is not lost because of disability or age or disease or any other kind of impairment. A person who's in a coma has not lost any dignity. A person with severe dementia who does not even recognize who they are or who their family is anymore has not lost their dignity. That dignity cannot be lost. And so we respect life in every single person throughout their life. And so recognizing the importance of life and the sacredness of life, then what the church also teaches is that when we look at a pregnant woman, for example, when you have a pregnant woman who has a human being in her womb there's different stages of pregnancy, from embryo to the fetus, the zygote, the embryo, the fetus. It doesn't matter how old that child is. Both the mother and her child have equal dignity. It's not that the mother now has greater dignity because she's bigger and older. Both the mother and the child have equal dignity, equal value, equal sacredness, and so one's life is not more valuable than the other. The church would say that they both have equal dignity, and so it's really important. And that teaching is also really important because if that wasn't the case, if a young little baby had less dignity than the mother, then what's the reason for that? Is it because the mother is conscious and aware of who she is? Well, that's dangerous because then what happens to people with dementia or people in a coma if we're basing on who is given dignity because of their ability to reason and their capacity for different intellectual abilities. And so the church says that no, it does not matter, how old you are, what your disabilities are. Every single person has equal dignity. And that's how come the life in the womb is respected and protected, because there's equal dignity to that child and to that mother. And this same child, let's say there's a baby in the womb who's at 10 weeks old, that child has equal dignity to another child who's 2 years old, or 20 years old, or 30 years old. So no matter our age or our location, it doesn't change our dignity. So whether the child's 24 weeks in the womb or 24 weeks in the ICU, the location does not change dignity either. As I already said, the presence of a disability, so maybe Down syndrome, or maybe they are missing arms or legs, or maybe they're blind, doesn't change their dignity whatsoever. Every single human life is sacred, inviolable dignity, and every life is extremely valuable. And the church would just say that any form of discrimination is not justified if we're based on age or disability. And so in the encyclical, I put the longer quote on your passage, but in the encyclical Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II just says, "To defend and promote life, to show reverence and love for it, is a task which God entrusts to every man." So to defend and promote life, to show reverence and love, is a task which God entrusts to every man. And so because of the sacredness of every life, then that's how come the church says that abortion at any stage is wrong. And so let's look at an elective abortion using these sources of a moral act. And again, I'm not trying to make any discussions about an individual's culpability or their specific situations, but let's just look at an elective abortion. An elective abortion, what kind of action is it? And this is important because it is a killing, but it's more than a killing. It is a direct killing of an innocent human being. So an abortion is a direct killing of an innocent human being. Okay. And so because it is the object of the act is this is the object, the direct killing of an innocent human being, then when we look at the end, the purpose, the circumstances, it can't make that action good. So because the object is wrong, direct killing of an innocent human being, which is also called murder. That's the definition of murder, is the direct killing of an innocent human being. Then abortion is always wrong. Now again, I can't get into the culpability of things because someone's culpability could change. It's immoral no matter what. But there are situations where maybe people, especially in society today, where there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of people, saying that the young embryos are not really human, they're not really persons. So there's a lot of confusion in some areas on this. So I think that's going to affect someone's culpability, their knowledge, their understanding. Are they under coercion? Are they under duress? So a lot of that's going to come into play with culpability. But when we look at whether it's moral or immoral, the object is direct killing of an innocent human being, and so that's murder, so it's wrong, always. No matter what the situation. And as I mentioned, even when the mother's life is in danger, the ends cannot justify the means. So the intention is noble to save the mother's life, but the object is still directly killing the human being. And so that's why there's a problem there. That's what we call a vital conflict, where there's two lives and they both are of equal dignity, they're both valuable, and there's this problem now, there's this conflict where you have these two lives. And so, and I can talk about that more at the end if you want to talk about those specific situations, but what we need to do is try to find a solution where we're not directly killing the baby. Are there other things we can do to try to save both lives or try to save one life, but not directly killing either the mother or the baby? And that's what the church would ask us to look at, is are there ways we can address the serious situations of vital conflict without directly killing the child? And so again, I can answer, it gets complicated in the medical field with that, but I can answer those at the end if you want. But that's how come the church would have a problem with, even in the situation of a mother's life. But also in the same situation as like rape, is that rape, yes, the intention is the mother maybe does not want to be reminded of the perpetrator, that she's a victim, doesn't be reminded of what happened, so the circumstances are important, but we still have an innocent child involved. And so you don't want to now punish the child for something that happened. And so the church would still say that it's still wrong because of the object of what we're doing. There's multiple crimes in the situation of a rape. Or if you have a rape and an abortion now, there's multiple crimes. So the church would say we can't do that. We need to look for other solutions to these difficult problems. And so that's the situation with abortion. And one of the issues in our society today is that many people do agree that murder is the direct killing of an innocent human being. So many people will say, yeah, murder is the direct killing of an innocent human being. Murder is always wrong. But they'll then say that abortion is okay because they don't define an embryo or a fetus as a person. And so there's this debate in the secular world about what is a person, and when does someone become a person, and when does someone get the rights of a person? Because even our country's laws say that a person cannot be murdered. They have a fundamental right to life. But the way our country's laws are is that that person is defined at birth. So once that child is born, then it becomes a person in the eyes of the law, and so then you cannot kill the person. And so before birth, though, that's why we have abortion being legal right now. But for the church, they would say, no, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. The reality is this human being should be treated as a person from the moment of conception, and should be given protection and that right to life from the very beginning. And so that's how come the church says abortion is always wrong, it's always immoral, and we need to protect these innocent lives. Okay. There's a lot that I could talk about when we also think about the embryo and the early stages of life, but just for time's sake, I can't talk about everything when it comes to the embryos. But whenever we have the stages of life, so technically like from the medical perspective, like at conception, the first stage is going to be like a zygote, and then becomes an embryo, and then a fetus, and then at birth they're a newborn. So the church say no matter what, all these stages, this is a human being who deserves all the protections and should be treated as a person. And so there are things, and there's different medical interventions and different technologies that are being developed. And the church is not at all against science. The church is not at all against technology. The church is not at all against medical interventions to help people. But the church says that we still have to be careful with technology, because sometimes technology can be abused or can do things that are immoral. It can help us do things that are immoral. And so when we use technology, we have to still make sure that we're protecting life and being aware of the fact that these stages of life are still the stages of a human being and deserve protection. So certain things, like for example, that are being developed to try to help women who struggle with infertility, or even women who aren't infertile but they want to become pregnant. Some of the techniques that, such as like in vitro fertilization, there's zygote transfer techniques, things that have a good intention of helping the woman get pregnant, are problematic And the reason is because the way that this life is created, so for in vitro technology, in vitro fertilization technology, for example, they remove the gametes from a man and a woman, so the sperm and the egg, and then in the lab, they'll combine them and cause fertilization to happen. So they create a new life in the lab. And the church says that that's a major problem because the way that human beings are designed is for the man and the woman, the spouses, to cooperate with God in the creation of new life through the conjugal act. So the natural way that God intends for us to bring new children into the world is through the conjugal act. So the church would say that any interventions that can assist the conjugal act in helping a man and woman become pregnant are good. But anything that replaces or substitutes for the conjugal act are immoral. They cannot be done because you're taking away that natural intention of the conjugal act. And the church says that there's problems with that too because children are supposed to be begotten, not produced in a lab or manufactured in a lab. And so it starts to take away the dignity of that person. And it dehumanizes that person because they often are becoming treated as objects. And what is happening, what we see happening is a lot of the embryos that are created in the lab, they are now starting to do, sometimes they'll do experiments on them. They'll kill the embryos to do different scientific experiments. Or they will help parents to select the type of child they want. Maybe like with blue eyes, or a boy or a girl, or make sure there's no genetic diseases. And there's this discrimination that's happening as to which child is going to be seen as valuable and be transferred into the woman. And so there's a lot of discrimination that's happening. And a lot of these embryos that are being created aren't being then transferred to a woman, and so many of them are being frozen or destroyed and killed. And so there's hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos that are just frozen, and they're just sitting there cryopreserved, and it's a problem because it's against the dignity of the life of these individual human beings. And so the church sees a serious situation here that's happened because we have started to create life outside of that conjugal act. And I can talk more about individual examples if you have questions at the end about, you may say, okay, well, is this okay or is this not okay, or can you explain this more about why these different techniques are problematic, or which ones are not problematic. We can get into that. There's so much that could be said about these reproductive technologies that I want to get to a few other things tonight rather than talk on those. But the key is just kind of recognizing there is an emphasis on protecting life, on respecting the dignity of each life. And part of our dignity is that we all deserve to have, a mother and a father, to be raised in a family. The church says that every child deserves to be conceived, carried in the womb, and then birthed as this result of a conjugal act. And that's also the idea of separating life from the conjugal act, the creation of life in the conjugal act, is also a problem against the spouses because there is this unitive and procreative value to the sexual act, the marital act. And so we can talk more about that too, but there's a lot of different issues that come to play when we start to separate life from that conjugal act that is a factor with some of these things. And so without getting into all the different embryology and the technologies there, just kind of keep that in mind. I want to continue on with this thread of life issues though, because a lot of times whenever I start to talk about, abortion is always wrong and the object is the direct killing of an innocent person, people say, well, what happens with like self-defense? Aren't we killing someone? If someone attacks me or my family and I have to defend myself and they die as a result of my actions, isn't that killing them? Isn't that murder? So wouldn't that be the same thing? And it's not. It's not the same thing. So we have to make a few distinctions. So murder is the direct killing of an innocent human being. That's murder. And so murder is always killing, but killing is not always murder. And what we mean by that is because God and the church through her law says that there is a duty that we have to preserve our life. It's not an absolute duty, but there is a duty we have to preserve our life and to preserve the lives of those we're responsible for. And in some cases, if there is what the church would call an unjust aggressor, so there's someone who is an aggressor and they're acting in an unjust way towards me, if the only way I can defend myself or those I'm responsible for is to attack back or to protect myself with some type of violence, then that can be permitted for self-defense, but I also have to do it in a proportionate way. So let's just use an example. A man breaks into another man's house and he threatens the man and his wife and his child, and it looks like he's going to attack or potentially kill them. He has a gun, he's very violent, he's very aggressive. So the question would be, if let's say Joe is the man who's protecting his wife and children, then you have the burglar. Is it immoral for him to defend the guy by taking his gun out and killing him, shooting at the guy? It depends. So if Joe kills the burglar, is it murder? Maybe. It depends. The question would be, is the robber innocent? No. He's an unjust aggressor, is what we would define him as, unjust aggressor. Okay? And so if this unjust aggressor is attacking, Joe has a right to defend his family and himself, but Joe can only use the force necessary to repel the aggressor. So if the burglar is just coming in, he doesn't have any weapons, and he's just yelling and shouting, wants to steal the TV, and then he's walking away, and then Joe shoots him, that's not permissible, because that is unnecessary force to repel the guy. But if the burglar is violent, he's attacking, there's a significant threat, the man thinks he's going to die, there's no other option, he's got to do something, and he takes a bat and hits him over the head or something, and the burglar dies, he would be justified, because it is using the force necessary to repel the aggressor and to defend his family. So it's a matter of how much threat is truly being posed. What options does the man have for his family? If they can just get out and run away, get out and run away. Your possessions are insignificant in this situation. Just run away if you can. But if the only way that he can defend himself is to do something in response, like taking a baseball bat or a gun or whatever he has available to defend himself, if it's the necessary force needed, then it would be considered self-defense. Because the aggressor is not innocent. It is direct killing, but he's not innocent. And as long as you've used what we call like a reasonable force to repel him, so it's unjust aggressor and you use reasonable force, and that's referring to this idea of what is necessary to defend yourself, then it can be considered self-defense and it's not murder. And then there's a difference between, the church says there's a difference between violence. Violence is essentially excessive force, and then reasonable force. So there's reasonable force, and then there's violence. Violence is typically excessive, and so violence is always unjust. But reasonable force can be used. Now, if you're doing an act of aggression and revenge, someone has hurt you previously, now you're going to go take revenge, that's not going to be something that is permissible because it's a different situation. You're no longer using reasonable force, and you're no longer doing it in self-defense. You're doing it for other reasons. And so the circumstances and what's exactly happening are very important in evaluating two people and their interaction with aggression or force that is needed. So self-defense. So you have an unjust aggressor involved, you're using reasonable force, and so if there is a killing involved, and it meets these criteria, there's reasonable force, unjust aggressor, and killing, it's no longer murder, it's self-defense, and so it would be morally permissible, as long as it met those criteria. And so related to this idea of self-defense is going to be war, because war is another situation where there's killing. So is the killing in war murder or not murder? Again, it depends. Is it moral or not moral? Moral or immoral? It depends. On your handouts, I put a really fairly long passage from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. I'm not going to read that, but it's number 500. It's important to read at some point, but I'm going to summarize it. And so what this is essentially explaining is something that the church has always taught for centuries, and it's called the just war doctrine. Just war doctrine. And so what it's essentially going to do is it's going to emphasize this idea of self-defense. Self-defense is going to be when wars are justified or permissible. So, for example, the church would say that a just, meaning like justice, a just war must be a defensive war. A war of aggression is always immoral. The church would say a war of aggression is always immoral, but a defensive war can be potentially permissible. There's certain criteria that I'll go through that has to be met. It has to be a defensive war. And so if it's a defensive war, the object will kind of act, it's a defensive war. You're defending yourself or your community or someone you're responsible for. Because the church would say that a state, meaning a state or a country, a nation, the state does have a duty to protect and defend the common good. So the state does have a duty to protect and defend the common good. In defending that common good, sometimes self-defense is necessary. Just like with the man and his family. So it must be a defensive war. And then when the state enters a war, it must be for a just cause. So it must be reasonable, there must be a matter of justice. Maybe defending the common good would be one. And it must be done with the right proportion. So the actions that the state does within this war must be proportionate. So it's not only defensive, it's for a just cause and there's a right proportion, a proportionate amount of force that is used. And so the church would say, it's the same idea as with a man defending his house. A reasonable force against an unjust aggressor. And so this would apply here too. And so there might be killing in a war as well. And that killing is not necessarily murder if it meets these criteria. But the church would also say that when we say all is fair in love and war, that is not true. All is not fair in love and war. There can be a just war, like you may have a war that is done for a defensive cause, and then people within the war can do things that are immoral. Or the state could enter the war for the right reasons, but then as time goes on, starts to become immoral in some of its actions. So things can change. So just because you enter a war and you meet these criteria, things that occur within the war could be problematic. So you have to have the right reasons for entering into the war. You need to have, it also says you must have a hope for success. Because if you have to recognize that you're going to send soldiers into war, so you need to have some hope of success with that as well. Now, a lot of this can get tricky, and this is why the church says that every individual situation and war must be assessed. We must use a lot of prudence, and we must continuously reevaluate the situation. It must be ongoing. We can't just say, oh, okay, I'm looking at this one situation, the war is fine, go ahead, do what you want. Every day, constantly reassessing to make sure we're staying within the bounds of being a war of justice. A war that truly is a defensive war, and a war that is staying within the moral bounds. Because if you start to get out of the moral bounds, it does start to become immoral. Now, I'm not going to talk about any specific wars in our history. I'm not a historian, I have no idea. I'm not all that knowledgeable about some of the wars in the past. But you can go back and look at different circumstances and wars and use the just war doctrine to see. And there are things that, even America, we have done that are not that would not fit the category of all the criteria for moral situations. So you can kind of go back and look at that. But in the Compendium of Social Doctrine, that paragraph I put on your handouts, read that later, but it does summarize this in a very eloquent way. that I think will help you begin to see what the church is trying to get across to us about war, is that it's really important that we take this seriously, but wars can be permitted and can be moral if we meet these criteria, because it's just like the man defending his home, but on a bigger scale, with a particular country defending the common good. All right, so I want to stay on this topic of killing one more time, or actually a couple more times, but because life is sacred, absolutely sacred, and so we need to defend innocent life and protect innocent life. But as you can see, there are certain situations that arise where sometimes killing may occur, and sometimes it can be moral. So then that leads me into kind of the next example where there is an act of killing that we want to look at to see what the church says about this. Because we do want to defend life and respect all life. And so many people ask, well, what about capital punishment and the death penalty? Because that does involve a killing again. What does the church say about this? Okay. So what is the object of the act? What kind of act is the death penalty? It is an intentional killing. It's an intentional killing of a person. So it is a killing. Is it murder? Generally, by definition, murder is going to be the intentional killing of an innocent person. So the person is not innocent. So there is a different situation with death penalty and abortion, for example. So the person is not innocent. Now, that does not necessarily mean that it's automatically okay to kill the person, but it is still an important element of the situation, is that the person is not innocent. So if the person has been rightly shown to be guilty, then it would be he's a guilty person. So guilty of a crime. Okay, so the person involved that is being killed, it's not the same situation. Okay. Doesn't mean it's okay yet, but now the church would say an individual person cannot ever do this. So the death penalty, capital punishment, is not something that is in the purview of an individual. The church would say it's limited to a government, like a state, a country. And the reason is because before, I don't want to say the church well, let me, okay. Don't get ahead of my thoughts, assuming that I'm saying that the church is going to say it's okay or anything, but, so it's a killing of a guilty person, and the church would say that it's in the government's purview, potentially, because the government has a duty to defend and promote the common good. So the common good is really important. So the government has a lot of things that we'll talk about it some next week too, but the government is to promote and defend the common good, which is really important. And so because of this duty, over the centuries, the past 2,000 years, the church has recognized that there have been times in the past where the government felt the need to have the death penalty in order to defend the common good. And the Church of the Centuries says that the government has the prerogative to have a death penalty in situations where evidence shows the person's guilty, and the death penalty is proportionate to the crime, and it is necessary to promote the common good, and there's no other non-lethal options available. So there's the common good. The death penalty is proportionate to the crime. The person is actually guilty, and there's solid evidence of that. No other non-lethal options. And it is necessary to promote the common good. So there's no other ways to protect the people from this person, and it's felt to be necessary in order to protect the common good. So the church would say there have been situations over the past 2,000 years where that was the case, because there have not always been prisons and jails like we have today. There were times where there really weren't any, or they weren't well enough fortified to defend the common good in certain situations. And so there have been times in the past where the church has said the government was just in acting on the death penalty in certain situations. There have also been many cases where it was not justified, where the death penalty had been performed in an unjustified way, and so the church recognizes that as well. And so what the church talks about is that one of the reasons for the death penalty in general is that it has essentially we can look at it as having two purposes. One is for punishment, for retributive justice, for punishment. A man who has killed innocent people is a murderer, and a proportionate punishment could be taking his life, not out of vengeance, not out of revenge, but because it was the only way to defend the common good from this violent criminal murderer person who was continuing to be a threat, and there's no other way to protect people from him or her. And so it has to have those caveats to it. The death penalty was also seen not only as a form of retributive justice and punishment, but also a deterrent to try to deter others from continuing to do these same crimes, because sometimes that was the only way that the governments felt that they could protect the people and the ongoing situation of other people doing the same thing. And so we understand that this kind of act, this type of killing, and then the intention is for retributive justice, punishment, and as a deterrent from others committing the crime, does not make this into the category of a murder. It's still a killing, but it's not murder. And so it is not necessarily in and of itself intrinsically evil and always wrong and always immoral. It can be justified in certain situations. But the problem is what the church has started to look at over the past many decades. You can read John Paul II, Benedict, and recently Pope Francis have continued to evaluate the circumstances. And what they now say is that if we look at the circumstances of different societies, is the death penalty necessary and the only way of protecting the common good now? Today is a radically different world than 1,000 years ago. And so especially if you look at the prison system and how it works. And so today in America, it's for prisoners to escape maximum security prisons, it's very difficult, if not impossible. There are ways we can protect the common good. And the prison system is large. We can support the prisoner population in general. So the popes of the past several decades have said, is this still necessary to promote the common good and to protect the common good? Even if we feel like it might be proportionate, and even if the person is definitely guilty, is it necessary? And so over time they've been asking this same question, and the same answer has come about, is that no, it is no longer necessary. John Paul II had said there are rare circumstances that he can think of where it was necessary. And then Pope Francis says most recently, a few years ago, 2018, said that he just can't see any situation where it's necessary in today's world. And so Pope Francis called for a movement to abolish the death penalty across the world because it's just no longer necessary in the society as we have it today in general. The church also recognizes that most justice systems, like our own in America, for example, they're not perfect. There are times when innocent men are found guilty when they're actually innocent. And so there is a concern that there may be a percentage, maybe even small, but there may be a small percent of people who are given the death penalty and they're actually innocent. And that is a very big problem. It's a huge problem because this innocent person is now being killed for something they did not do. Because the systems are flawed, they make mistakes, we're human. The justice system is a human system and we make mistakes. And so for that reason too, the church says that we need to be really, really careful with this penalty for crime, this punishment for crime in general. And then we have to continue to prudentially ask ourselves, is it necessary? And so that's kind of why you've seen this change over the past several decades in the church too, is that yes, we recognize that there were times it was necessary, but now it is not. And in 2018, Pope Francis changed the wording of the catechism as well, to really emphasize that we need to move to abolish the death penalty across the world, because it's no longer necessary. I put several quotes on your handouts about some of the different passages, and you'll see some of the passages explain why the death penalty has been seen to be morally permissible in some cases, and then it moves into like Pope Francis and the recent catechism statements about how it's no longer something that the church sees as being necessary, we should move to abolish it. It doesn't mean that you can't have some disagreements with the church on this, but we do have to say, well, you know, I can see where maybe these situations, it could be reasonable or necessary, but the church does ask us to kind of submit our will to hers and say that we should help her move to abolish the death penalty at this point. And so that's how come the death penalty is killing, but not murder, but still, you know, is morally permissible in the past, although the church just does not feel like we can justify it anymore. All right, now if you have questions, definitely at the end I'll take some. So I'm going to get to the last example in the last little bit that we have, and then I'll open the floor to questions. Because the last example that I want to talk about that is a killing is something becoming more and more talked about in the world. But it's euthanasia and then physician-assisted suicide. And I think these are really important to talk about because they are becoming more and more in the news across the world and in our country. And both of these are examples of a killing, and so we want to talk about where the church stands in her teachings on these actions. Euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are actually, there's a distinction between the two when it comes to the medical use of these two words. Although in the church's documents, she seems to kind of combine them. So when she talks about euthanasia, it's really both. I mean, she uses them interchangeably. She, in her documents, pretty much always says euthanasia, but she does include the physician-assisted suicide. They're very, very similar. It's just what exactly is happening is a little different. So with physician-assisted suicide, which is the one that is legal in a few of states in our country. Euthanasia is not legal in America, but in a few states, physician-assisted suicide is. And so what physician-assisted suicide is, as the name suggests, the doctor or the medical provider will give the patient a prescription for a medication that the patient can later take on their own that will result in their death. And it's something the patient requests for whatever reason. It's usually kind of towards the end of life, but not always. And so it's the physician assists because they provide the prescription, but the physician does not do anything more. So it's the patient actually doing the action of committing suicide by taking the medication to result in their death. So it is a suicidal act by the patient, but the physician helps. Euthanasia is when the physician or a medical provider of some kind is the one who does the action that kills the patient. So at the patient's request, the medical person would maybe inject a medication that will result in their death, or something like that. So the physician or medical provider is doing the action of injecting the medication, giving the shot that is going to kill the patient at the patient's request. So it's still suicide because the patient's asked for it, but now the medical person has a much more direct role in that person's death. So that's euthanasia. But they're, and like I said, in the church's documents, she basically calls them both euthanasia because they are essentially both suicide of the patient, however that is played out. And so I put several quotes on there, but in one of them, Evangelium Vitae by John Paul II, he says, euthanasia is in the strict sense understood to be an action or an omission and this is kind of a complicated definition that's important. It's an action or an omission which of itself and by intention causes death. So it's an action or omission, which means you do something, or omission means that you intentionally do not do something, and that action of itself causes the death of the person. And more often than not, the reason given is that the person wants to eliminate suffering. So that's euthanasia. And you can read it in some of the quotes that I have on there. But there's also a longer document the church did called the Declaration on Euthanasia. Very important, very good to read. But it talks more about euthanasia in general. And so it's important to note the church says this is an action, so something I do deliberately, freely and deliberately to bring about my own death, or I allow a person to do an action to me, I request that action to bring about my death. Or if I deliberately omit an action, something that would be life-saving and I do it intentionally because I want to die. I'm going to talk about some distinctions here in a minute because there are some important distinctions. But that's the idea of what euthanasia is. So for example, a patient has cancer, he was given 3 months to live, and he now requires oxygen for continuous oxygenation because he no longer can oxygenate himself normally. But he's not imminently dying. He's okay, he's fine, he has cancer, he just needs this oxygen. He was required to stay in the hospital, this is a fictional thing, he's required to stay in the hospital overnight because he had to run some tests for his cancer. And while he was asleep, the nasal cannula, the thing giving him the oxygen, fell off. And the nurse's monitor goes off and is beeping and she can tell his oxygen's dropping. And the nurse says, you know what, this man has a miserable life. I'm just not going to put that oxygen back on, right? And then he dies. So she committed murder because she omitted doing something that was proportionate that he needed. But let's say the man had told the woman, you know what, I'm miserable. He's not dying, but he's just miserable. He's like, I don't know what's going to happen to me in 3 months or 6 months. I really don't want to go through it. I'm really worried and afraid, and I feel alone, and I don't have family. I just am not loved. I'm just done with I'm done with life in the world. So if something happens overnight and oxygen falls off, just don't put it back on me. And so she does that. It falls off and she doesn't reapply it. This would be essentially an act of euthanasia. She's omitting giving him something he needs for life. I mean, it's a fictional example. That's not how it happens, but that's the same idea of how omitting something could still be a problem by not doing something that's proportionate, that is going to lead to the person's death. So those would be kind of this category of someone committing suicide or assisting with suicide or even murdering somebody if it was against their will that you did that. But euthanasia sometimes becomes a problem in how we talk about it, because there also is the example of what Pope John Paul II had said in Evangelium Vitae, that euthanasia must be distinguished from a person choosing to forego aggressive medical treatment. So in people who are sick and dying towards the end of life, there does come a point where you are approaching death and there are certain medical interventions that are overly aggressive or they're disproportionate to your situation. And you say, you know what, I'm just going to accept the nature of my disease and let time play itself out and just let the disease take its course, and I do not want things that are disproportionate and extraordinary done for me. So I just want to withhold from doing those things and just allow nature to take its course. I know that I will eventually die and probably soon die, but I just don't want to do things that are extraordinary. The church says that is not euthanasia. That's accepting the condition of the human being, that we are all going to die, that we are all going to experience death. And so that is distinct from someone who is doing an action or omitting something that is going to cause them to die on purpose because I'm just done with life. There's a difference. There's an acceptance of the human condition, foregoing things that are disproportionate, and that's different than euthanasia. And so this does become really complicated, and that's how come we have a lot of people, priests who get training in moral theology or bioethics, people at the hospitals who can help you make these decisions, especially the Catholic hospitals, who can help you kind of work this out to say, well, what's proportionate, disproportionate, what does that mean? How can I make these decisions at the end of my life so that I'm not intentionally doing something that's immoral? And without getting into too much detail, and the document, the Declaration on Euthanasia, talks about this, but the church would tell us that there are things that are proportionate and disproportionate, and this is what's really important in deciding when it comes to medical treatments. And it's looking at my medical condition and what's proportionate versus disproportionate. Things that are always proportionate, or sometimes you'll hear it called like ordinary means, are things that are going to be like keeping me warm, preventing bed sores, making sure you're rolling me over in the bed. In many cases, it's going to also be nutrition, hydration. There's a caveat there, but in general, for most people, that'll be ordinary, proportionate. Making sure that the windows aren't open and blowing cold air and causing me to have hypothermia or something. So things that are just natural caring for the person are proportionate. You should never refuse those and not do those things. But then there's disproportionate things, and it's looking at the condition of the patient and looking at what's my hope of benefit? If I do this intervention, how much might I benefit from this? What are the risks? What are the risks versus the benefits of that intervention for my particular situation? And you can't really give a list of this is always proportionate, this is always disproportionate. It depends on each individual circumstance. There may be situation, for example, where the ventilator is not necessarily disproportionate. So for example, let's say I'm healthy, and I get a pneumonia, and I need the ventilator to assist me to breathe for a week or two, but they expect I'm going to recover. Well, that would not necessarily be disproportionate. It could be, it depends, but it would not necessarily be disproportionate because there's a good hope of success. It's not going to burden me. They'll have me sedated. I won't be in distress. They'll be giving me antibiotics, and then I'll recover. But there's a different situation where someone may be imminently dying in the last stages of cancer, probably only a week to live. They get a pneumonia. You may not necessarily put a ventilator on that person because it might be disproportionate to their situation. The hope of benefit is not going to be the same. And so that's how the church looks at these things, but that is not euthanasia, by saying, you know what, I'm imminently dying, I'll die within the next few days, I really do not want to be on the ventilator and sedated, I want to use my last few days to be with my loved ones and to talk and socialize and do what I can before I pass. That's reasonable, and so that's not euthanasia, accepting the nature of the human condition and the nature of your particular disease. And so euthanasia is just distinct from that. And so John Paul II does talk about that a lot, or at least to a degree in Evangelium Vitae. And so he says, euthanasia must be distinguished from the decision to forego so-called aggressive medical treatment. In other words, medical procedures which no longer correspond to the real situation of the patient, either because they are by now disproportionate to any expected results, or because they impose an excessive burden on the patient and the family. In such situations, when death is clearly imminent and inevitable, one can, in conscience, refuse forms of treatment that would only secure a precarious and burdensome prolongation of life, so long as the normal care to the sick person is not interrupted. And certainly there is a moral obligation to care for oneself and to allow oneself to be cared for, but this duty must take account of concrete circumstances, and it needs to be determined whether the means of treatment available are objectively proportionate to the prospects of improvement, and to forego extraordinary and disproportionate means is not equivalent of suicide or euthanasia. It rather expresses acceptance of the human condition in the face of death. And that's Evangelium Vitae number 65. And so he talks about that. And so it takes, when I was getting my master's in bioethics, there is a lot of nuance, there's a lot of discernment and prudence that you have to look at each individual situation. And so it's really hard to say this always is or isn't. But it's important to know there is a distinction between euthanasia and these situations. And then working that out just takes some time and some conversations with bioethicists or moral theologians or priests that kind of help us work that out. So I could spend all day talking about that, but it's complicated. And so it's just important to realize there is that distinction. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end about that if there are some. But it's important to just know that euthanasia, the church would say that euthanasia and assisted suicide today are often called like mercy. Oh, it's mercy to kill that person, called mercy killing. The church would say it's false mercy. Mercy is not about killing someone. Mercy is about true compassion. Spending being in the presence of that person, giving that person your love, caring for that person, helping to do what you can to help their pain, helping to share their pain with them. And so the church would say that, oftentimes when people are dying and suffering, if someone does request euthanasia, there's usually something deeper: loneliness, sadness, not feeling cared for, not feeling loved. And so it's on us to start to be that person for them, to show them true compassion, true mercy by being with them in their final moments and in their suffering. And that's what the church asks us to do, is recognize these things are out there, but it's not truly compassionate and merciful to engage in these actions. So, okay, I'll stop there. We have about 10 minutes, and then I'll stick around afterwards to answer questions. And I've tried to put in some quotes in your handouts that are relevant. There's a lot more that could be there, but these are just a few that may help to touch on some of the topics we talked about when it comes to some of the life issues in the church and that we talked about tonight. So hopefully that was helpful. I know it's a lot. And next week we'll talk about the social doctrines of the church, which is a further extension of some of these important teachings. All right, I'll stop. Questions that you guys have, or other life issues or life questions, moral questions, I'll see if I can help answer.
This is a moral question I have. A person that's being kept alive by artificial means, the vents, all of that, for extended periods of time. I'm talking like into like 5 years. And the only thing that's keeping them alive is these things, and the only reason they are being kept alive is to the financial gain of the family. Where does
So she said, like, there's someone being kept alive by a ventilator and artificial means for extended period of time, months or years, because of the financial gain of the other family members. What does the church say about that? So it's difficult to speak to individual situations without knowing all the details. But if if it's evident that there are financial means or financial gains involved, that is going to be incredibly problematic, because it's not respecting the dignity of that person. So when we are suffering and dying, we still are deserving the utmost respect and respect of our dignity, and it can become dehumanizing, and it can violate our dignity to extend our suffering unnecessarily, or to as the church said, like to prolong life unnecessarily, or to put us in situations where it's a burden, excessive burden to the person, to the patient. And so if that patient is, and it was against the patient's will especially too, like if the patient, this is not what the patient had wanted, that's problematic. So there's a lot of issues with that, but absolutely, whenever someone makes the decision to keep a patient on a ventilator, it's because they are acting in the best interest of the patient. It has nothing to do with the living members, so of the families. Like let's say I was in that situation, I was approaching death and I was on the ventilator, being kept alive, then once I'm no longer able to make medical decisions, then I have a person who makes those decisions for me. So kind of a healthcare proxy essentially. So they make decisions for me. Well, when they make decisions because I'm no longer able, they have to make the decisions that are in my best interest, or they have to base those decisions on what I had expressly wanted. So when I was alive, or no, when I was had capacity to say, here are my wishes, as long as they're reasonable, then that should be respected. And so if I had said, I do not want to be on the vent for an extended period of time, but my proxy or other people kept me on the vent even though I didn't want to, that's violating my dignity. Even if I had never expressed my intentions, you have to ask, is this in the best interest of the patient? Am I showing them love and concern and respecting them with my choices about their medical care? And if all I'm doing it is for selfish reasons, then that's a problem. That's violating their dignity, that's not respecting them, that's uncharitable and unjust. So I can't say in that specific situation all the details, because you would have to know what the patient wanted, what's their circumstances, lot of factors. Are they looking after the patient's best interest? But if it's very clear that the only reason is the financial gains of the others, that's going to be a problem.
Wow.
That's going to be a problem. Because it's all about the patient and their dignity, not about what I'm going to gain from it. It's like with anything in life. I don't want to abuse people for my own gain, and that could be a scenario where that happens. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I disagree with the whole disagree about the death penalty. I take a Jewish position. The death penalty is an affirmation of life, not of a consequence. One, if you let really bad criminals, I'll give you a personal example, Manson. You know what happened? They kept the guy alive. He had a couple followers. People praised him. He had a whole internet around him. When you keep evil alive, it is alive. It infects us. Right. Two, when you do get the death penalty, there's two types of death penalties. The laws. We're dealing with the law. State everyone agrees with it. There's two types. The crucifixion is a perfect example of that. Jesus was crucified for political reasons. The other two people were convicted because of violence. Among that. They broke the law that everyone agreed that perpetuates life, because you can't trust it. Two, as you said, it's an example of, how can I say, it's an example, you don't do this. Humans have to have boundaries and consequences. Another incident I know of where Chicago, Illinois, doesn't have a death penalty. A person, this guy, went to Illinois and killed this woman because she broke up or whatever. And he said the only reason he did it is because there's no death penalty, because where she wasn't someplace else, there's a death penalty. So it is a deterrent for that. But not having clear boundaries, what's good and what, is the problem when you don't have a death penalty. Because the jail system, the way it's set up, the guy, and then the people that, the loved one that's been killed, and how they were killed, they have to suffer all of it. She's dead, he's dead, and that person's living and being comfortable. The jail conditions, you won't believe how good they are. They get special food.
I know. Well, I think you can, and the church will allow you to kind of debate on this, and there are many people you can go, I'm not really expressing my opinion one way or the other. This is what the church says right now. And you can go read. There's debates going on. But the church, that's why the church hasn't said that it's always wrong. It's just right now, over the past few years particularly, Pope Francis says that he just feels like there is no need for it anymore.
But he's
But-
never worked in the prison.
Well, there's definitely debates, so you can there's definitely church debates about it, but that's kind of where he feels we should be moving now, is just to recognize the dignity of these prisoners, these criminals, that we should give them more time to have their own conversion. We should go, do our works of mercy, go visit the prisons, go try to evangelize, try to help conversions, give them a chance to convert. That's going to be where he's going to see this, is let's respect their dignity of life and potential for conversion. But yes, I think the church over the past 2,000 years has recognized that situations change, circumstances change, societies change, but those are where she's going to look at it. Are we respecting dignity of the person? Are we respecting the common good, protecting the common good?
But the dignity of the person that died, got killed, murder, that's an intentional act planned out by definition, and brutal way, and the families that's connected to that person. The suffering to saw a person that killed, murdered, literally intentionally live is very longevity. A lot of people for their whole life, it's like, have I left, and these get to live a good life.
Well, I think it can be debated. There's victims all across. And there's a lot of victims too who would tell you that they felt that when they watched the execution of the person who killed their loved one, it didn't help. So it's not necessarily going to help the survivors, but it can, right? So I think it's something that you can debate, and I think it's something that the church allows us to continue to debate. It's just over the past few years there has been a move to encourage that.
But it's against the Jewish tradition. That's what I object to.
Well, I know the Catholic Church though is the fulfillment of the Jewish tradition.
That's my point.
So,
That's my point.
but it's the fulfillment.
Right.
Jewish tradition can be lacking some things.
Well,
So
but that's the point. There's no question about the Jewish tradition on this, because Jesus never repudiated the execution process.
Right, and the church allowed it in the past too, so I mean, it depends on the circumstances, but,
But it's the state that you have to question.
yeah.
And what they're doing.
Well, we'll move on, because I think people understand kind of the concerns, and definitely read the debates. There's a lot of debates going on in the past few years among Catholics, so, yeah. Yes, sir.
So the last point you were discussing, is that kind of along the lines of like the DNR, is that what they call it? The Not Resuscitate?
So do not resuscitate is a option, so if someone does choose to be do not resuscitate, that basically means if something does happen where their heart stops beating, then it's a request by the patient to not have the medical staff give them CPR and try to revive them. Do not resuscitate can be something that people are permitted to do if it's proportionate to their situation, so, or if it's disproportionate to their condition. So if a person does feel like they're imminently dying, or if they feel like by CPR it's only going to cause more burden and suffering, which it can, CPR is not successful very often, and it often can cause a lot of harm and suffering. And so if someone does feel like their condition is such that doing CPR is only going to make them suffer more, then you can sign the DNR order where you say, I do not want to be resuscitated if something happens. And the church said that's permissible as long as it is, you look at it and you look at disproportionate things to your circumstances, and it's disproportionate to your circumstances, then that is definitely reasonable. And that's what DNR means. It just tells the staff not to try to do any aggressive measures to try to restore your heartbeat and your circulation, if that makes sense. But yeah, that's what DNR means.
I have a question in reference to, the question on number 12, page 43, what to do once the body is, has died, once someone has died. What does the church say or feel towards being an organ donor?
Oh, being an organ donor. A few things. So once you die, the body is no longer you. I mean, you as a person, you have now died. Your soul has gone to heaven, and the body remains on earth. But the body must still be respected. So the church says that it is no longer that person, but that body still should be cared for and respected and treated properly. And so the church does want burial of the body or of the cremated remains. You bury those out of respect for the body is one thing. The second thing, as far as like organ donation, it does permit organ donation. So after death, the church does see that it is a charitable thing to donate organs. It's also charitable if you're living, like if you have paired organs like a kidney and you want to be an organ donor, that is a very charitable act. And so the church does see organ donation as a charitable thing. So if after death, after the person has died or declared dead, then they can donate their organs for sure. So that's the most brief answer to that. You can get into a whole lot of different discussions about some of the details of organ donation, but that's kind of what the church would say. It's a charitable act to donate organs. But the body must be respected at all times. So once the organs are donated, the body is then buried still. You can also, the church does allow a person to donate their body to science or to like medical schools, as long as the bodies are respected. And that's one thing in medical school that I have never forgotten, was our cadaver that we did the dissections on during our first year. I mean, the faculty were incredibly insistent about how much respect we had to have for that body and for that person, for that person's body. There's no longer a person, but so like whenever you were dissecting and looking at different things, we had to always keep all the different parts of the body in the same place, because after we were finished, they would then cremate the bodies and send them back to the family for burial. So it had to be incredibly respectful of the donation of that person. And so the church does allow that as well. So you can donate to science, donate to medicine. You just have to always treat that body with respect. And ultimately, once the science or whatever has finished, you bury the remains.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay.
You're talking about a burglar coming in and the dignity of life involved. When someone comes in, this is murder versus killing. You come in with a weapon, spot and kill them and all. Isn't that proportional? If their intention is to kill
It
them?
depends. Do you know their intention? I mean,
It's
some of them
inherent.
come for a threat, some come to
No.
harm.
No, when you walk in with a gun or a knife to a burglar because you're in territory, you're breaking in, and they resist anyway, they will shoot you or
I think it depends. I mean, I think I can't really make a judgment about an unknown situation. I mean, I think if the person who is acting on self-defense, if they think that it's a force necessary to repel the person and is proportionate, then that's what the church is gonna look at. I can't just necessarily say broadly that every person with a weapon necessarily would be justified. I don't know.
That's different to it. I do an absolute. If someone comes in a house and they have a gun or a knife, they're gonna try to take your life. They have no choice. That's the point, because you resist, they're gonna act. So if you don't take care of them, they will take care of you.
And I think when it comes to moral things, I think it's a little more gray. It's not black and white, because as we talked about, there's a lot of details that you have to look at with that. So I think we just have to be careful when we look at situations as outside observers, and we can't judge people's hearts and intention. We have to be careful. It doesn't mean that a person's not going to be justified in using force if that happens, but I think it's hard to make broad, absolute statements. I think we have to just be careful when it comes to the morality of things and looking at all the different elements of the act and what's going on. But that's why you have to look at each individual circumstance, know all the situations, all the details, and we have to be careful. That's why I'm going to be a little more broad and less absolute, because there are some caveats and nuances. So, but it doesn't mean that in many situations or something that's the case. But
I got one more question. Here's right up your alley.
okay.
Do you think it is moral for the hospice, take federal money to do euthanasia on a person?
I mean, I'm only really going to, I can really only talk from the church's perspective. I mean, the church holds that euthanasia and physician assisted suicide are wrong. I mean, to get into the secular politics of things, I mean, I don't really want to go there, but I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I'm Catholic and I live my faith, and so I think that is going to define how I'm going to look at different situations politically and when it comes to medical things. And I think that, without diving deeply into the politics of things, I mean, I think that's how the church wants us to live our faith in every aspect of life, and how we approach all those different questions, that we should promote moral living and moral life by everybody. All right, so I'll stop there, and if you have any questions, otherwise you can come up afterwards. But let's conclude in prayer, and then I'll let you go. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen.